Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. In yesterday's episode, we saw what happens when the people of God attempt to do the will of God, but in disobedience to His ways. It never works out well. He will not accompany those who refuse to do His will. He will not fight on behalf of those who choose to do things their own way and against His wishes. But now God gives the next generation of Israelites another history lesson designed to show them how God had been with them all the way, ever since the days of Abraham. He will bring up the descendants of Esau and Lot, two groups of distant relatives who were living near the land of Canaan. The Israelites were going to have to pass through the lands belonging to the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, and the Moabites, descendants of Lot. The very existence of these two nations were tied to events that had happened long before the Israelites had ever arrived in Canaan. And yet God, in His sovereignty, had preordained that these two nations would be ready to assist the Israelites when the time came. God had been with the Israelites ever since the beginning, even before the people in Moses' audience had even been born. Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea, as the Lord told me, and for many days we traveled around Mount Seir. Then the Lord said to me, "You have been traveling around this mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command the people. You are about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the people of Esau, who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you. So be very careful. Do not contend with them, for I will not give you any of their land, no, not so much as for the sole of the foot to tread on, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. You shall purchase food from them with money, that you may eat, and you shall also buy water from them with money, that you may drink. For the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He knows you're going through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing. So we went on, away from our brothers, the people of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arabah road, from Elath to Ezion-Geber. And we turned and went in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said to me, Do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. The Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them, and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave to them. Now rise up and go over the brook Zered. So we went over the brook Zered, and the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation, that is, the men of war, had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them to destroy them from the camp until they had perished. Deuteronomy 2, verses 1 through 15. Moses continues his recounting of the Israelites' history in an effort to remind his audience of all that had happened over the last 4 decades and prior to their arrival at the border of the land of promise. Moses seems to have at least 2 objectives in giving this impromptu history lesson. First, he wants to remind his audience of what happens when God's people prove unfaithful and disobedient. There will be consequences. More than 40 years had passed, and the nation of Israel was just now preparing to cross over into the land that God had promised to Abraham. But the delay was Israel's fault, not God's. They had been to this very same spot before, but had refused to take God at His word and trust that He would give them victory over their enemies. So He had sentenced them to 40 years' confinement in the wilderness. But in a sense, it was a life sentence, because that entire generation died in the wilderness, having been forbidden from ever stepping foot into the land of promise. And Moses is out to ensure that the offspring of those unfaithful rebels do not repeat the same mistake. But there's a second point that Moses is trying to make, and it's of even greater importance. He wants this new generation of Israelites to recognize and appreciate the faithfulness of God. In spite of all that the nation had done to offend God by refusing to trust and obey Him, He was still going through with His promise to give them the land of Canaan as an inheritance. Here they were 40 years later, and poised to enter the very same land their fathers and mothers had turned their backs on. And it was all because their God was faithful. So as Moses tells the story of Israel's long and somewhat meteoric relationship with God, he comes to another chapter in which God's faithfulness can be seen. But this time, it's a bit less obvious. In these verses, Moses describes Israel's journey around Mount Seir and into the regions of Edom and Moab. To us, those two names mean nothing, but to an Israelite, they would have carried a special significance. Edom was the land given by God to Esau, the older brother of Jacob, and Moab was the land occupied by the descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. The book of Genesis records the story of Jacob and Esau, the two twin boys born to Isaac and Rebekah. While the two boys were still in Rebekah's womb, God had decreed that Jacob, who would exit the womb after his brother, was to receive the blessing of the firstborn. God, according to his sovereign will and in keeping with his divine plan for mankind, made the decision to choose Jacob over Esau. It made no sense from a human perspective and seemed to go against all accepted protocols concerning the firstborn and the inheritance. But God, who is just and right in all he does, had a good reason for his actions. And the prophet Malachi puts God's decision in very black and white terms. Addressing the people of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, God said, "This is how I showed my love for you. I loved your ancestor Jacob, but I rejected his brother Esau and devastated his hill country. I turned Esau's inheritance into a desert for jackals." Malachi 1, verses 2 through 3, the New Living Translation. The Apostle Paul picks up this story in his letter to the Romans and expands on its significance. For God had promised, "I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." This son was our ancestor Isaac. When he married Rebekah, she gave birth to twins. But before they had done anything good or bad, she received a message from God. This message shows that God chooses people according to his own purposes. He calls people, but not according to their good or bad works. She was told, "Your older son will serve your younger son." In the words of the Scriptures, "I loved Jacob, but I rejected Esau." Are we saying then that God was unfair? Of course not. For God said to Moses, "I will show mercy to anyone I choose, and I will show compassion to anyone I choose." Romans 9, verses 9 through 15, the New Living Translation. Neither Malachi or Paul are insisting that God literally hated Esau. The point is that in comparison to his treatment of Jacob and his descendants, God's actions towards Esau appear hostile. He had chosen to bless one and not the other, and yet God still gave Esau and his descendants land. And God would not allow the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, to have any of the land he had given to Esau. "You will pass through the country belonging to your relatives, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. The Edomites will feel threatened, so be careful. Do not bother them, for I have given them all the hill country around Mount Seir as their property, and I will not give you even 1 square foot of their land." Deuteronomy 2, verses 4 through 5, the New Living Translation. God was faithful to Esau and his descendants. He had given them land and had obviously blessed them with food and water, because the people of Israel were able to buy provisions from the Edomites. It's interesting to note that all these generations later, God was sovereignly using the descendants of Esau to meet the needs of the descendants of Jacob. God had strategically placed the Edomites right where they were so that they could play a role in helping the Israelites reach the inheritance God had promised them. Moses goes on to record that the Israelites left Edom and headed for the land of Moab. Once again, God warned the Israelites, "Do not bother the Moabites, the descendants of Lot, or start a war with them. I have given them Ar as their property, and I will not give you any of their land." Deuteronomy 2, verse 9, the New Living Translation. Here we have yet another example of God's faithfulness, and to understand it, we have to turn back to the book of Genesis. Lot was the nephew of Abraham, the father of the Israelite nation. Lot had accompanied Abraham from Ur and had settled in the land of Canaan. In fact, at one point, Abraham had allowed Lot to take his pick of all the land, and the book of Genesis records, "Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went there with his flocks and servants and parted company with his uncle Abram. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom and settled among the cities of the plain." Genesis 13, verses 11 through 12, the New Living Translation. Lot picked the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar, and we're told that the whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord or the beautiful land of Egypt. Genesis 13, verse 10. But Lot didn't stay in the fertile plains for long. He ended up settling in the city of Sodom, a place of great wickedness. And when God eventually decided to destroy Sodom and its sister city of Gomorrah, he allowed Lot to escape with his 2 daughters. And after their narrow escape, Lot and his daughters settled in a cave. But fearing that their family line was doomed to die out, Lot's two daughters, who must have been heavily influenced by their time in Sodom, came up with a plan to get their father drunk and have sex with him, so they could prolong the clan. And the book of Genesis records the outcome of their immoral decision. When the older daughter gave birth to a son, she named him Moab. He became the ancestor of the nation now known as the Moabites. When the younger daughter gave birth to a son, she named him Ben-Ami. He became the ancestor of the nation now known as the Ammonites. Genesis 19, verses 37 through 38, the New Living Translation. Now here were the descendants of Abraham, the uncle of Lot, getting ready to pass through the land occupied by the descendants of Lot. And Moses makes a point to stress that this portion of the land had been occupied by a race of giants called the Edomites. And Moses goes out of his way to stress that these people were as strong and numerous and tall as the Anakites, another race of giants. Deuteronomy 2, verse 10. Don't miss the significance of what Moses is saying. Back in chapter 1, he pointed out that the first time the Israelites reached the edge of the land of Canaan, they had refused to enter because they said, "The people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven, and besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there." Deuteronomy 1, verse 28. God had used the Edomites to rid Anakites from the land of Canaan, but the Israelites had failed to believe that God could do the same for them. In a sense, Moses is pointing out that God had faithfully used the descendants of Esau to help prepare the way for the descendants of Jacob. This whole portion of Moses' story is meant to stress the faithfulness of God. Everything that had happened in Israel's long history had been the work of God, all the way back to the days of Abraham and Lot and Jacob and Esau. God had been sovereignly orchestrating every single incident in order to set up this moment in time. And Moses wanted the next generation to recognize that God was with them and had been with them all along. He was and is faithful.